preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching.
Wonderful. So I want to look at the word preach because we cannot skim over the importance of what Paul is commanding Timothy. So from the help of Bible Hub, I have a definition of what preach looks like to sort of challenge us. So to properly to herald, proclaim, to preach, doctrine and teaching that he needs to guard and teach. So there's going to come a time, he's saying, when people will not hear the truth of what Timothy is saying, that people will not listen, but instead they will gather teachers that suit their own desires. So if we stop and think a minute on the image that Paul gives us here of itching ears. At the beginning of my teaching, I had an itch in the middle of my back that I could not reach and I could not satisfy, and it wouldn't go away. And so I went to Keza to have her help me get rid of that itch. So think about the last time you had an itch. When you have an itch, you almost automatically, without thinking, reach to scratch it, right? You don't really stop to think about it too hard. If you have an itch, in the same way you